7 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few kickers I would start this week. The first one's Nick Folk of the New England Patriots. And Nick Folk, he's been a pretty decent kicker this season here, and he's got a great matchup versus the New York Jets that give up the second most fantasy points to kickers. So it seems like every other game is when Nick Folk has a big fantasy week. So right here, the Jets, like I mentioned, give up the second most fantasy points to kickers. And in week 2 at the Jets here, he had 12 fantasy points in that ball game as Nick Folk. So it wouldn't surprise me to see him have double digits this week. And he's a kicker I definitely would start. The next kicker is Daniel Carlson of the Las Vegas Raiders. So Carlson, he's back on the radar this week. After the last couple weeks here, he's been struggling at the kicking position. But last week, he finally bounced back, was Daniel Carlson. And he's got a good matchup versus the Philadelphia Eagles that are prone to giving up points and prone for kickers to score here. So right here, this is a ball game in Vegas, obviously indoors, better kicking environment, and I think Carlson in this one could get anywhere from 7 to 10 fantasy points, and he's a kicker back on the radar. The next kicker I would start this week's Young-Ho Koo of the Atlanta Falcons. So Young-Ho Koo, he's been a decent kicker the last couple seasons. I know he's been dropped in a lot of fantasy leagues because of the bye week, but Koo, going into the bye week, had his best game of the season with 11 fantasy points. And now right here, week 7 at the Miami Dolphins. It's a great matchup. It's going to be good weather most likely. And the Dolphins give up the 3rd most fantasy points to kickers this season. So I think this game could be a mini shootout between the Falcons and Miami. And I think Young-Ho Koo, he's good for 2 or 3 field goals and a couple extra points in this one. And he's a kicker I definitely wouldn't shy away from, and I would start this week. The next kicker is Evan McPherson of the Cincinnati Bengals. So the rookie, he's been pretty impressive in my opinion this season. Here's McPherson. And last week at the Detroit Lions, in a great matchup where the Lions gave up the most fantasy points to kickers this season, he had 11 fantasy points. And this week, points might be harder to come by here for Evan McPherson and the Bengals, with a tough matchup at the Baltimore Ravens, who give up the 3rd least amount of fantasy points to kickers. But this guy, he's got unlimited range in my opinion. And if Cincinnati wants to stay on track with the Ravens in this game on the scoreboard, they're going to have to try a few field goals. And McPherson, he's a guy that could kick it, like I mentioned. And he's a guy, no matter what the matchup is, he's almost a player I would start each and every week in 12-team leagues or deeper. And the 5th and final kicker I would start this week is Zane Gonzalez of the Carolina Panthers. So Gonzalez, a deeper league type of start this week, unless you have a kicker on bye and need to get someone on the wire. Bad ad, because he didn't get added in much fantasy leagues after the waiver wire period was up the other night. So the last 2 games here for Zane Gonzalez, good fantasy days. Week 5 versus Philly, 14 fantasy points. And last week versus Minnesota in week 6, 8 fantasy points. So right here, another good matchup for him in week 7 at the New York Giants that give up the 7th most fantasy points to kickers. And right here, I think this ball game is going to be a pretty high-scoring game, or a game that's going to be in the mid-teens to high 20s, where we're going to see both kickers, Graham Gano and Gonzalez, have many opportunities. But right here, I think this Panther offense has been pretty good this season, and Gonzalez, he's going to have a few opportunities. So that's a few kickers I would start here in week 7 of the fantasy football season.